It's 5 o'clock, so I think we'll go ahead and get started.
Sure.
If you're ready.
Sure.
All right. So today we're going to talk about the non-motorized project prioritization policy and get some feedback on that and any updates that we may want to look at before we begin prioritizing our future projects. So I think Jessica was going to go through that today.
Okay.
I just want to kind of go back and review why we started this process, talk about what all we gave you in your agenda, and then really I want to hear from you, from those of you who've been through the process about how you thought it worked, and then maybe some weight in from people who haven't used the process yet about how you interpreted either how it got used or questions you might have. We began the process of looking at how to provide a quantitative approach to prioritize projects in recognizing that there was standalone money for bicycle and pedestrian improvements and realizing that we had approved non-motorized plans. So we had a pedestrian plan, we had a bike plan, we had the Ped Bike Issues Task Force report that all had lists of projects that had been prioritized through some public process with public engagement at a community-wide level. And so recognizing that rather than just have a dialogue where it's just whoever's requesting it and whatever's popular or political at the time, we should try to focus on how can we implement the priorities that have been identified through these processes with this funding at a high level to recognize we have more needs than what we can ever try to tackle in any one year. So how do we start to provide a systematic approach to that? So in the agenda, we provided you a copy of the current policy. We provided you kind of the history of decision making. So we provided the agenda from the meeting last year that kind of showed the projects that were selected, how they scored and what was presented from staff to the commission. We provided a re-export of the scores kind of with updated notation that we could based on what projects were selected or completed or kind of in process. So you can see where on that scoring list some of those projects fell. We provided you the 3 correspondences that I had on record that were citizen requests or correspondence in relation to the non-motorized policy since we've used it and since it had been adopted. So I want to kind of just talk about high level, some things that we recognize, what we think we're going to look at addressing kind of in starting to begin work through this update. We believe that kind of as staff, that our recommendation would be to remove ADA ramps from this policy. We feel like it would be better managed as an administrative program with sidewalk hazard and or by a new ADA coordinator that's in the process of being hired, mainly because it needs to be more reactive than a one-time-a-year decision about handling ADA ramp improvements. It needs to be someone that it's a more managed program where if there are requests made for people based on mobility, that it can be, it's more programmatic. So that's one of the things that as staff, we feel like as we move through this process, that's something we kind of learned and as we moved forward with. We've talked about, we know we're getting ready to begin a new process for safe routes to school planning. And some of the conversations that we've had so far to date have kind of been around one side versus no sides and prioritizing maybe places where there's some on no sides versus some on one side. And so we thought that might be something we want to call out with some different scores, both for local and for safe routes in terms of some of those prioritizations. We are working with our GIS staff to hope to be able to show you what it looks like to compare the pedestrian access to priority destinations as we have it now versus where it looks like an accumulation of points based on density of location. So we'll show you kind of 2 different matrices, I think, in that process where what we're looking at, what that looks like, that's based on the request we received to kind of consider where we should maybe prioritize things where the destinations have accumulated. So we'll look at that. We think based on some of the roadway volumes that we need to have some lower thresholds to stratify those average daily car trips, both for the roadway volumes and for the crossings. And those really apply to, that kind of comment is going to apply probably to both bike and ped in terms of some of in terms of some of those points. So we'll be kind of looking at where those stratify and considering that. We know with the updated pending bikeway plan, we're gonna have a conversation, hopefully at your next meeting, about looking at that final draft plan. And some of the context of that plan is gonna lead to some changes, I think, in relation to the bikeway demand. The bikeway demand model will be updated. We've added a community service centers and like dense, so for commercial development, and also parks into that model as part of that plan. So that could impact this scoring system. Priority and secondary network. A conversation about how does level of comfort play into scoring ratings of projects. So if you're, for example, currently have a street that has a level of comfort score 5, and the proposed project moves it to a 2, how does that compare to something maybe where you're moving a 4 to a 3? And is there some way you want to weight projects that increase the comfort to a greater degree? And then crossings and intersection treatment scoring in the safety criteria for bikes. We think we need to also there stratify the AADT for both volumes and crossings for that. So those are the kind of things we've had conversations about on a staff level that we think have been impacted by how the policy has worked, or how we're evolving those conversations and dialogue that we're hearing about planning of issues that we've had. But I'd welcome anyone if they want to talk about how they think the process went before, or issues you might have had, or other things you would like us to kind of have that conversation about as we look at putting a draft together for you to entertain next month.
Anybody? Nick, you ready?
I haven't been involved in this process before,
Oh.
so I'm pretty new.
So, yeah, maybe let's start with that first question, which is, how did it feel, I think, to have what you had presented for the members of the commission that were here for the last project selection process? Maybe speak about that experience of what you felt like you got in terms of that recommendation, and how if you felt like it did or didn't help in making that decision about which projects to select.
Well, just briefly, I think it went okay. When we first started talking about, this type of analysis using data-driven, information, we kind of looked around the table and said that should be the start of the conversation, not the end of it. And over the years, I've used created my own for whatever, and that's how I always felt about the data. And it's been a while, but I think we did have some good conversations, and I think they were facilitated by the information that you guys brought us. I think the public had quite a bit of input too, that was useful. If I recall, on Naismith Drive, we had some conversations, but I think that's the answer to the question. I do have one question about your process, and if you want me to wait for that, I can.
I don't care either.
Well, I'm kind of wondering, when you guys, who sits down in a room and comes up with the numbers? Is that a group of people in your office, Jessica? Is it, it's got to take a lot of work to go through that. I'm just kind of curious about what that looks like.
So it's a model-based approach. So we
Okay.
tell a GIS model how to kind of weight it.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah, so
Okay.
there's nobody's manually assessing projects. So that's a little bit of a limitation and an aid in trying to have something that's interactive that we can continue to use, that we can ensure can be updated over time. So many of these are all GIS layers that assign certain points to geometric space or shapes that have been assigned in a model. So we can update the model by changing how we tell it to weight something, or rerunning it maybe based on changing. If we add projects, we could run it to change
So when you get
things.
those numbers, you just, that's
So
it? It is what it is, basically?
So for the most part, I think, we have to spot check and validate the model to make sure, in cases to see how stuff's kind of shaked out. But for the most part, it's a model-based
Okay,
prioritization process. So
Okay.
we will need to, for example, in this new prioritization, the model is going to have to update. One of the things that we assess in the model not for scoring, but for decision-making is this project on a safe route or CDBG, Community Development Block Grant funding eligible? Well, those boundaries have just changed. And so that would be something we would need to we'll update the shapefile in the GIS model, and it will give us an assessment, a yes or no, based on is it spatially located in
I
that
see.
area.
Okay.
So there could be some things that change that maybe aren't driven to the model, but that are updated as part of the process.
Okay, okay.
For information that's given to you to help make decisions.
Thank you. I needed that refresher
Yeah.
on how this works.
And that's a little bit of a challenge as we get into some of that, because you note, in a couple of the requests we got from the community, they had asked for cultural, social, and economic development assessment of these projects. And I'm just not really sure on what level, what quantitative data you would use to be able to assign scores to projects for that level. And the goal of this really was, because this is, and as we heard transportation commissioners tell us, is this data really should be the start of the conversation. And in which case there's these equity and project distribution, opportunities for parallel routes, grant funding opportunities, economies of scale. Those are things that our model can't really give points to. It's, you know what I mean? It's really a starting point. So likewise, in some of those other factors that have been requested, it might be something you want to consider as other procedure or other things to
I
consider.
would.
To
Yeah.
consider, but
Yeah.
I'm not sure what, unless somebody, like can point us to a quantitative data point that we can use to kind of, at the level of funding we're choosing, it's kind of seems like a lot of work if we would try to figure out, like, I don't know how to assess economic development potential of projects. I'm not even, you know what I mean? For the basic model we have for selecting projects, I think it's more amateur than
Yeah.
that.
So, I'd like to throw some ideas out there. One, I appreciate, Jessica, when you're kind of describing where staff's thinking about some of these things. That you mentioned safe routes and maybe pulling apart whether a route has no sidewalk on either side versus it already has one on one side. And I remember years ago we talked about kind of how you prioritize that funding. I think one consideration, I'm not sure if it's built into that model then, is the demand for that infrastructure increases the closer you are to the schools. And if you look at the route maps, putting a sidewalk 1.5 miles from a school because there's no sidewalk isn't the same as a 1/2 mile from the school where there's no sidewalk. And I think somehow the model should accommodate or should prioritize the sidewalk infrastructure, the gaps especially, where it's closest to the schools, because that's just honestly, especially elementary schools, that's where you're going to have more foot traffic. And so maybe there's some combination, the proximity. I think there's something already built in there around like how far away something is to a priority destination. Or maybe it can be blended in with safe routes all by itself. I'm not
It
sure.
is, but it's a separate score, so right now it's not correlated necessarily just to safe routes.
And maybe
I'm not
that's
sure
fine.
how that-
Maybe that's
yeah.
fine, because it's considered in, if you put those schools as some of those key priority destinations, maybe it gets captured that way. The ADA transition planning, I was just kind of curious if, as you guys were thinking about that, well, about the ADA work, we haven't heard about the ADA transition plan update, and so I guess I'd like to know more about what that transition plan update looks like and how that's evolving to shape your thinking on whether we prioritize ADA improvements. So that's more of just a placeholder. Like,
Okay,
I think it'd be helpful to know more before we pull that apart or
okay.
do something different. And then I wanted to also just kind of step back broadly. One of the limitations of the model is that it begins with an assumed list of projects. And I think when we kind kind of forget that for a moment and just ask ourselves what really matters and how we spend the money, we know that over several different efforts to collect input from the community, what always comes back up is the safety of crossing streets. And so I just wonder, is that public concern really captured with the list of projects? So is there any other way to kind of make sure we're accounting for where that concern is most acute? Like which intersections are most concerning to the public? How would we even figure that out? And is it more important to figure that out than to say, does a sidewalk need to go here or there? Or do we need to build this bikeway? So I'm not sure how the current process would ever capture that concern, which comes up constantly. So I don't have a solution to that. I just kind of noticed that we began with a certain list of projects, and that became then our, the question wasn't, is this the right list of projects? It was, how do we prioritize this list? And maybe there's something else we need to think about. How does that list get?
Well, I wonder if that, can that
identify.
file be filtered by category?
Sure.
Or how do we connect
There are
it,
very few crossings
connect
because,
projects to that concern? I mean, maybe there's a way
Yeah.
to say, this would impact street crossing in a high traffic area or something like that. I don't know. I'm just realizing like one of the fundamental pieces is we begin with a list of projects, and then we kind of have all this, analytical work to prioritize it. And maybe we've missed the boat by beginning with that list of projects if the concerns aren't even addressed
sure.
by that project list.
And Charlie is correct. There are very few crossing projects on the list, mainly because the plans that we pulled the project list from don't have specific crossing improvements
Right.
listed like they do gaps,
Right.
where we took that. So I think that would probably have to be identified. I mean, I think you got to go back to a planning process.
I've always thought for years, like if it's inexpensive to paint bike lanes, if that's an effective facility, then that's a pretty, you get a lot of bang for your buck, assuming that it's an effective facility type. So if we thought, about how does it, the crossing treatments, how effective are they at increasing actual and perceived safety? Would that be a good investment of limited resources? As we've heard about the bike boulevard design, that seemed to be a really key feature. And if there's a bike lane that exists on both sides of an intersection, but what happens as we currently stripe that intersection is the bike lane disappears, and then we're kind of left not knowing maybe what to do. If it's really effective to add green guidelines for cyclists and motorists to be able to know what to anticipate, then maybe that's a good intervention that we haven't really considered on our project list. So that's one example where I think getting to the heart of what the concern that keeps rising. Every time we ask, it always comes back to that, it's not safe to cross intersections. And with the
Would it have to
rapid,
be a separate database for planning? I mean, I was asking questions about crosswalks and where they are also. You might want to include crash data somewhere in that, but making sure that they're near the bus stops and they're near the intersections, major
So
intersections.
I think that those are all factors that have to be evaluated when you go back and do, like identify priority crosswalks or crosswalks if you had us over some certain threshold that warrants whatever design.
Mhm.
When we looked at scoring, we looked at crash data, but it really just didn't end up working out because of how the model would attribute crashes to certain line files within a proximity, not necessarily because that gap is a factor of not having a sidewalk, or, like the crashes not maybe a factor of not having a sidewalk, but
Mhm.
we felt like it would attribute to projects indirectly that weren't really a causation of the crash without more investigation. That happens kind of in the design process when you get into after a project is selected. Yeah, I'm not sure what the answer is to that. besides.
Well, we know that turning vehicles are always a hazard to cyclists and pedestrians. Left turns and right turns. Being near a school, the pedestrians are not necessarily orderly and they're not gonna walk up to the traffic light. Any activity area, really. Bus stops, the one I asked you about before. But just a few of those logical things. In downtown Mass, if you ever want a hazardous place to walk, it is it. Crossing those streets with the cars creeping around the corners is not safe. And there, I was downtown on a Monday morning, and those folks were not going 20 miles an hour. So we could be doing things that aren't going to dig up the concrete, like enforcing our laws. It's supposed to be 20 there. And just, I don't know, more crosswalks, no right turn on red, whatever.
So from a technical perspective, is the crash data basically attributed to a certain geographical location? And can you get it for both car to car on its own, car to ped, car bike, all that kind of stuff? It can be kind of aggregated or disaggregated as you need to.
Yeah.
And then is the problem trying to find a way to normalize it to some kind of metric so you can actually compare it across things like crashes per mile, crashes per intersection, per
So
traffic?
first off, the data in terms of geolocation is spotty at best.
Okay.
Mainly because there's no geocoordinates entered on the crash report. It's like maybe depending on how officers wrote it, like 400 feet southwest of this intersection, or some say, and then what happens is that gets submitted in paper copies to the state, and the state has prisoners who geocode it, and then give it back to us. So sometimes intersections can get skewed for crashes, like those get pulled in, but unless you actually read pull up the PDF of each individual report, you wouldn't be able to necessarily attribute causation to a certain facility.
Wow. So it sounds like more of a police equipment problem, whereas they're doing it on paper, which should be done on a device that has a geolocation service.
Yeah, so the
Yeah,
state
okay.
just has a motor vehicle accident crash report. That's their standard report. And so there's also some challenges with data in terms of, like, we haven't even gotten 2018 crash data. It takes until July, basically, to get it from the previous year. So there's a delay in that process also when you're looking at some of that stuff. We can get some of it locally, but then there can be some other data issues. We also already know that from some other work that we've done in both our bike and ped plans, that there's a lot of crashes that involve bicyclists and pedestrians that are underreported. And so kind of thinking about how those are attributed and looking at some of those. So you could spatially say causation is one intersection and go look at making improvements there, but it might not have been that sidewalk gap that was the cause of whatever crash was there.
Yeah.
So it's not necessarily saying, you can't necessarily improve safety just by looking at the crashes and where you have crash
And I don't think I would
density.
expect that either. I mean,
Yeah.
I would just expect, like, this general area is prone to crashes. We don't know why, but there are crashes happening, which means people are not great drivers in this area, which means sidewalks in general could be benefited, regardless of what side they're on. I mean, but it sounds like the core issue is the data's crappy, so there's not much you can do about it.
Yeah, and then if you look at those type of hotspots, which we've done some of that crash analysis, you're looking at arterial and, I mean, in a lot of cases, arterial and collector streets. All of our hotspots, I think, were on arterial streets. In which case you've started looking at both volume and classification as a way to try to prioritize those areas for gap infill.
Yeah, okay, so it's a redundant metric at this point, basically.
Well, and that's kind of when we had this conversation, that's why it's labeled safety, but it's put in here as volume, because oftentimes I think both speed and volume are proxies for
Right.
that safety metric. We felt for this type of data-driven model that they were well enough proxies for the level of detail we needed to be able to start to select the project. Then when you get into design, that's kind of the appropriate thing where the engineers need to dig into those reports to determine what type of other geometric like for other roadway projects, are there other geometric
So
improvements
is it totally
besides?
unacceptable to look at the crash data spread out on a map and say, oh geez, this looks like it's got a lot of dots, and then go in and study it? Could we do some kind of a
Well,
reverse? on it?
you currently do that for different projects. Like how you choose highway safety,
Yeah, or
talk about that a
vehicular
little bit.
crashes. Yeah, so we can use some of that data to get safety funds. if the project would alleviate the crash, put in a roundabout instead of a four-way stop, those sorts of things. We use that data to apply for safety grants, but as Jessica mentioned with bike ped crashes and just the reliability of where they're at, how they're reported, and then getting into the report and figuring out would a crosswalk or whatever it is, would that alleviate the crash or not? And a lot of them happen at signalized intersections where you have pedestrian phases, you have crosswalks already. It's just more of, it's compliance between yielding to pedestrians or whatever the case may be.
I guess what
So-
I'm trying to say is you can try to quantify everything and base it all on data, but sometimes you can anticipate using the human brain a whole lot better. And I wouldn't want us to not do that.
Well, I think kind of a broad statement about how this last process went, I think, is it put in writing the factors that were being considered. It explained the limitation, and I think then left us to have to figure out what do we do, because it's all ultimately our judgment, but the model allows us to at least evolve the decision-making so that it's more transparent to the public, like what constitutes this prioritization approach. And I think that allows at least greater evolution of that approach. Like, we should be over time be able to say, this factor really matters and we still haven't found a way to measure it. So how do we get to the day when we have data? I mean, I'm kind of wondering where you're at with the neighborhood traffic, what are we calling that? Neighborhood traffic management. Like, how does that feed into the prioritization matrix? Maybe not this year, but it feels like that's another piece of the puzzle. We want to ensure that funding isn't all dedicated, that we don't have money to also invest in neighborhood traffic management if there's a need for it. Or is that another bucket altogether that we gotta, like, maybe the big prioritization is kind of like we did with bike ped, just split it in half. Maybe we need to think, how much money for this, for that, and then what's the process for each of those buckets?
So how are the projects selected after that? I remember at one time, the city was coming up with a sum of money, and they would take whatever projects would make that sum of money cost. Are they still doing it that way, or do they have a more prioritized system?
Well, so in this. So this is kind of what I was talking about in terms of, we showed you this is the staff report that was provided to the Transportation Commission in the last round when they were making decisions about projects. And so they kind of gave a background of the different funding that was available, and then made recommendations basically based on that. But I'm going to scroll down. Here's the sidewalk one. But I'm going to scroll down to where this list of projects. So like for bike projects, you can see what got highlighted as proposed, and that's what got brought to the commission. You can kind of see how the point of this really was to show you that while score was one point in the conversation, obviously not all the highest scoring projects were selected. There was some, so staff brought together a recommendation that weighed project score, but also with available funding, right? So some, if they weren't CDBG eligible or whatever, they weren't proposed as part of that funding source, to try to piece together a program that made sense, that reflected some of the data approach, but also the qualitative understanding about where stuff was being mobilized or what available funding sources were available in that. So this is the bike one. And then these are you can see how those were spatially distributed based on each of the funding sources. And then you can see kind of that project list. And from the list, but you can see there's still some on page 2 out of, I think, a page, I don't know how many, I think it's 6 pages, maybe it's 5 pages. So a couple on page 2 that were CDBG, you could see, but otherwise you can see how they kind of spatially distributed the scores. It wasn't just necessarily, like you said, it wasn't everything, if it scores the highest, it's automatically guaranteed funding, because it still has to be to put together that pool. And so staff has kind of taken that initiative to recognize there is this policy, we're bringing together a budget of proposed programs to let the Transportation Commission respond to. And that's where you kind of have to take it from there, which is, we've used the policy, we've used our knowledge of availability of funding and different sources and phasing and timing of stuff to put together a program then that you can weigh in on and change, and make recommendations to change if there was something else that you wanted to evaluate or bring up in that process.
I remember that meeting pretty well, and it was a good meeting. Like you said, we didn't take the top scores. We had a pretty lively discussion about the projects, and we didn't agree. It was not a unanimous, 1, 2, 3 on this at all. So when I think back to that meeting, I think, do you guys recall that meeting? Well, I think we challenged the whole thing quite well, actually. And that's the way it's supposed to work.
Sure.
Yeah.
So if the ADA ramps are administrative and they're not part of these projects, will they still be part of that budget, or how is that going to work?
The ADA ramps are getting separated out from the bike ped pool, so they'll be their own. There'll be a separate budget item for ADA ramps. I believe it's $250,000 next year.
And will that be something that we see, or is that just totally out of our?
I think we would bring the projects to you
Yeah.
guys. I guess we haven't thought about that yet, but
Okay.
I don't see why we wouldn't
Okay.
do that.
And
Yeah.
there's some kind of an ADA transition plan, did I hear?
Well, we've identified the need to update it. We've identified the need to have an ADA coordinator, and I believe that recruitment will start very, very soon, is what I heard as of last Friday.
And there
So-
are ongoing efforts of building about self-evaluation tools for ADA for both facilities in the right-of-way and all of the city facilities and buildings. And that process has already begun and is underway as part of building data and asset management tools to help us better identify needs and assess those and document improvements and exemptions as they arise in the field. So that work is already happening, and then the MPO has some budgeted time also to assist a new ADA coordinator in writing an evaluation plan, particularly the parts that pertain to the public right-of-way.
And this ADA coordinator is inside a building and outside a building? Is it all inclusive?
Correct,
Yeah.
yes. Yeah, so it's even things like our website and services and access to events and that sort of thing.
Okay.
It's our public responsibility.
Mhm.
So I have kind of a more general question, because I'm still fairly new to this process. I don't know, can you guys all hear me okay? Am I loud enough? So, I guess I'm curious, it looks like obviously there's a general pot of money for all non-motorized vehicle projects, and they're all ranked. It looks like, however, the ranking criteria are different from modes of projects, so ADA and sidewalk apps and pedestrian and bike are all judged a little bit differently, right? So I guess in that case, the question is, if they're all funded from the same pot but they're judged differently, how do you determine how many of which mode is going to get funded each year? And is that up to the Transportation Commission usually, or is there some kind of, one of this, one of that, one of that?
In the previous year, the Transportation Commission got the total amount of recommended number, and then based on some of the other grants that were available, set funding for each category before staff came back and made this proposal.
Interesting.
So
Okay.
the commission made that decision based on information that was presented to staff, based on also other funding sources that had been introduced, because
Okay.
that's only one funding source out of many.
Okay. I guess what I was worried about is like, what if for some reason in 2020 all the bike projects are scored really, really high because they're super necessary, and all the ped projects aren't scored very high? I'm like, well, why would we do any pedestrian projects? So that seems like it doesn't happen, but
Yeah, so they've separated the money first to say, okay,
Yep.
out of this
Okay.
total pot, here's this much and this much, and then they funded.
that makes more sense.
And then we
Okay.
made recommendations.
That's kind of what I was getting to, is the big bucket question, like how much
Yeah.
goes in every bucket? If bike, ped, neighborhood management, traffic management, ADA, are those our four big buckets, you know?
And a
Or-
lot of that's being determined as part of the budget process in the CIP. So as David mentioned, if that ADA one's getting called out, that's kind of, or getting pulled out, those are kind of larger budget decisions that are getting made by the city commission then that kind of have programs you weigh in on, but don't get a set priorities of that high level funding for,
Well, the
because those are
neighborhood
being made by the
management
commission.
budget was from traffic calming money. wasn't
Right.
Yes. And that'll be, so those are kind of all programs that somehow coordinate towards larger efforts.
Have you covered everything you intended to cover, Jessica?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's gonna be some challenges. I'm not sure that we'll be able to answer all of the questions in terms of figuring out how to accommodate all of these issues to give you a better tool. But I do think there will be some updates, and like Charlie said, this is gonna be a continually evolving decision-making tool that can hopefully give you the best information possible to make decisions about how we
I think it would be good to have some
prioritize stuff.
footnotes, like what Marilyn has said, and Michael and others have, you know, that, in terms of non-quantifiable,
I
you
think,
know, things that we should have we should be looking
I
at.
think we can add that to other relevant factors. We can list
Yeah.
some more things,
Okay.
yeah.
What I'd like to think about is how do we get to the point where we have acknowledged crossing safety as an issue that we at least have it on our radar, and we need to figure out how do we prioritize treatments that'll improve those crossings. Maybe it's arterial and collector crossings as a way to simplify it, and neighborhood traffic management addresses other sorts of crossings. And I'm thinking of the concern about Old West Florence getting across to go to downtown, or getting across to go over to Pinckney. You know, if the pedestrian and bike demand model suggests there's a lot of bike crossings in that area of town, then maybe that's a way to say, all right, we filter it down to that. We look at that at collectors and arterials, and where there's no signalized crossing for X hundred feet. You know, you see people on Sixth Street crossing, you know, I guess, I don't know if it's jaywalking or not, but they're crossing where there's really nothing except for their own.
Do you see that do you see that process of kind of basically identifying an additional list of crossing improvements to add to the list? Do you see that as a
Possibly.
process maybe that Transportation Commission does, or you think that's a process that like the MPO should explore because it's a continued concern?
You
Like
know,
as part of a
if-
bigger study?
It always comes up, so it's like, what's our way of capturing that? And it's like kind of acknowledging it so that we know, yes, crossing safety is an issue. It affects, you know, it's a driver of ongoing concern. I don't know. I just feel like we don't have any way to point to something and say, oh yeah, we've got that. We have a lot of project lists, but not that. In the first round of the Safe Routes data collection, you know, that was one of the highest concerns the parents had was crossings. And I wish we could have figured out, like, which crossings, you know, which crossings is it really? And so it feels like we've never systematized a way to identify and then acknowledge, you know, like, yep, we know that's a concern. And it's on our list of, we're still struggling to think what's the way to systematically address it. But if we could at least have that list of crossings, like we have a list of projects, it would feel like a step forward, you know, like we know that.
Maybe it's a parallel activity.
And it
Because
might be.
What
It
you're
might
doing
be.
is, what this is data-driven. But but data-driven means that somebody died. Surely we can anticipate some of the problems before something disastrous happens.
Well, and possibly it's something we evolve out of the Safe Routes to School planning process that we're beginning this fall, because I do think there's based on the data and research that have been done around crossing and yield rates, and
Mhm.
I think that's just gonna continue to be a growing concern.
Yield rates is like, that's the key. If you can
And-
figure out how to monitor yield rates across, you know, all these crossings, then you could
Yeah.
prioritize where to do something.
Right.
Because it might be enforcement is the
Well,
primary intervention.
And possibly the valuation of crossing guard location determination. I mean, I think that all
Yeah.
kind of weighs into the conversation around which crossings need to be prioritized.
And that might help with the residential streets more so than collectors and arterials. So I don't know how you'd
Could
kind
be.
of give
yeah.
it, what's the way to identify those main crossings that are maybe not going to be captured through the safe routes planning, so. I mean, Tennessee is an obvious one, so, and Sixth Street, so. There's others, I'm sure. Yeah, I mean, that's essentially, that's the challenge, is people, I guess the way to tell it is, would you let your kid go out there on their own to do it? And, my answer is no. So for me, the safe routes was getting across Sixth Street. Yes, it's a signalized intersection. I still wasn't feeling comfortable letting her navigate the intersection. Is there infrastructure improvement? Probably not. It's really about education. So in that case, it's back to how do our kids learn how to do this? How do parents do that well, or bring the schools into how do we, provide appropriate pedestrian crossing education? And maybe there's an enforcement issue, I don't know, but for a parent to feel comfortable, it might not be just we need to build a better intersection. It might be we need to teach children how to ride or walk across really difficult intersections that won't ever change. They will actually be difficult. Just, I'm not sure how that gets into our prioritization, model, but it feels like at least we can ensure there's enough infrastructure in place that there's nothing about it that's not safe. It's just the user now
Right.
needs to.
Well, and
learn,
possibly it's a decision, depending on how we evolve the tool and whether or not that still raises those current crossings in the policy, that you choose and advise staff that you'd like to do a year where you do crossing improvements. And you know what I mean?
Mhm.
And we evaluate, and there's some sort of evaluation there, like the currently approved crossing improvements or something
Do you
we'd like to
include,
prioritize.
Any criteria from the Federal Highway Safety Administration website? They will actually say there are things that are hazardous to pedestrians or hazardous to cyclists. Do you use that in your decision model?
And they have some criteria on what treatments to use based off speed or volume or the length of the crossing. So I think there's some guidelines on what to build in certain situations. And that's something that we would use if we were gonna go out and put in a crosswalk or an improvement for a crossing at a location. So some tools to use or some guidance to use on what to do. It's kind of where, it's where we want to do it, and then what is the appropriate treatment. I think those are the two different things, so.
So you're doing it location by location, basically.
Yeah.
In the bike map, the online map that you put together quickly for me, there are yes, no, and grade separated crossings. Is there a way that those no's were identified? Like, is there a place that says we should have a grade separated crossing, but we don't? Or there's some criteria for that?
The yes, no, I think is just in the table is does it exist or not, and it's either yes or no, and the column is grade separated. And so we chose locations that were on the higher volume shared use paths where
So maybe that starts to get to like.
it starts to prioritize at a high
And it's
level, I
crossing,
think.
so it's kind of
Yeah.
like.
It's not every
Yeah.
crossing, and it's not
Right.
every crossing
Right.
on an arterial,
Well, and you wouldn't
and it's
have
not every shared
grade
use
separated
path.
crossings.
Those are the ones I think we heard from in the process from the public that
Yeah.
were of the largest concern.
So maybe there's a way to like expand on that. How does the focus on crossings and the concerns people have about
I
that?
don't think we've
So,
done that in our planning work. So I think there's opportunities to improve how we identify improvements.
In 2040, have we addressed infill and urbanization in our transportation planning at all?
In terms of, We-
Density,
we're-
how you handle the intersections, whatever?
yes and no, I think probably. It's tied back to, remember, Transportation 2040 is the transportation chapter of Plan 2040 of the comprehensive plan. So in that regard, we have those sorts of things. There's not design standards for urbanization necessarily in terms of that. But there, as those intersections are evaluated and reconstructed, you're using the best national guidance as design standards to evaluate projects and to go through that process to design improvements.
Okay.
I think we ought to do some public comment, and we have a little time left. We can continue until 6. Anybody interested from the public?
Good evening. My name is Michael Davidson. I reside at 900 Delaware. I don't know if you're aware of this, but I was at a Final Fridays presentation by a professor at KU who has created a map of bicycle accidents in Lawrence. If you haven't seen it, I think it might be something interesting to look at. She was very impressive in how she gathered all the data and things like that. And if you haven't seen it, I think it's worth, you can just reach out to KU. Okay. Have you seen it? Have you shared it?
No, but she's requested data from us and worked with us in the past, and I actually hadn't seen it until the same night that she was even presenting it, which
Okay.
I was like,
Okay. Well, it's available. I think it's worth taking a look at. It was a very interesting report. In terms of getting around this town, I grew up in New York. I spent a lot of time in New York City. I've never felt as unsafe trying to cross a street in Lawrence and downtown. The lights, people just ignore them. And I don't know how you can handle that, what you can do about it, but clearly, when you have a walk, it's not necessarily safe, particularly in the downtown area. So I don't know if that's an enforcement issue, but again, I'm convinced if I'm being hit by a car when I'm walking in a crosswalk, it's going to be downtown Lawrence. So thank you.
Thanks.
Just noticing, my friend and I live on East 25th Terrace, where we've been neighbors almost 30 years, and observed the sidewalk situation. Prairie Park School's down at the end of Kensington, right down our street. And last fall, they were in clearing out trees and putting down utility markers and things like that. And I was asking what they were going to do, and they said, well, we're going to put a sidewalk over here. And then nothing ever came of it. And the gentleman this morning told me that we didn't have the funding for it or whatever. But in reflecting them, picking the, and we were finding it on the list over here. Hopefully it's pretty far down the list. This project is clearly going to concentrate more children down a speeding street. Those cars go roaring down East 25th Terrace between Kensington and Harper than any place I've seen. And to put more kids going up and down the side of that street. People next to me just moved because they've got little kids, and they said there are just too many speeding cars through there. I just cannot. I don't know how it got on the priority list at all, but it's on there, and I think maybe sometimes in an effort to make someplace safer, reroute the kids or whatever the priorities are, I think sometimes it can make it more hazardous. And in other projects that you come up with, I would imagine that would be part of the process. You know, are we going to make something worse, or are we going to make it safer? And this is clearly one that's, because we've lived there all these years, and we saw a little boy killed up at Harper and East 25th Terrace. And so they were out there measuring my driveway in the front yard today, and he said, well, it's just a study, and I hope somehow that gets that gets off the study, because it's clearly one sidewalk down the second side of Harper from East 25th Terrace to 27th East 27th Street. But clearly the students go that way anyway.
Could you give us your name and address, please?
My name's Michael Tennyson,
Mhm.
Tennyson, 1725 East 25th Terrace.
Thank you, thank you.
And that East 27th Street is, I think, you know, it's fairly busy street, and it's designed, there's kids signs all over the place, you know. That street is designed for the students going to Prairie Park grade school. And 2 sidewalks going down Harper would clearly send the students down that direction and away from that speeding street. As much as I hate speed bumps, East 25th Terrace down east of Harper needs at least one, because they go roaring down there all day. My witness right here.
Thank you for your comments.
This.
Yeah.
This is my concern. When my kids were going to school over there, I would go out and stop traffic. Tell them if I caught them coming down the street speeding like that, I would call it off. Now that we don't have any kids coming down the street for 30 years, our most concern is that to put a sidewalk on the other side, then kids gonna be trying to cross the street to get over there. And with the cars coming as fast as they do, one of the kids is liable to get killed again. As of now, we can watch them stay on the other side, and it would take them all the way around to the school. But you know how kids are. If they see something on the other side, they're going to want to try to cross the street. And we don't want that to happen. We don't want the kids to get hurt, even though we don't have that many kids coming down the street. But they come down there doing 40, 50 miles an hour. And if you were to put a speed block up there, a couple of those, I think it would slow the traffic down. Now, we've spoken about this before, but nothing never happened. Before that little kid got killed, we told the city that they need to trim that tree that they planted there. No, they waited for the kid to get killed. Now they want to cut the tree down. But why did we do that before that happened? So we're trying to avoid that this time, to keep our kids from getting hurt.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Can you give your name and address as well?
Yeah.
My
could-
name's Charles Jackson, and I stay at 1717 East 25th Street Terrace.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Gary Weber, 907 Merle Court. Couple of things. One, Jessica, before you take these projects and start thinking about them for 2019, you'll make sure you get the CDBG changed to reflect the new CDBG neighborhoods.
So this is from the previous agenda
Yeah.
packet. There's also a list up here where we've taken those off if it is or isn't eligible,
Good.
or because we recognize that was an issue.
Okay, the other thing I wanted to say is I'd like to reinforce Charlie's request to look into the possibility of different rankings for SRTS streets that have only one as opposed to two. I think we ought to find some way to prioritize SRT, or Safe Routes to Schools that have no sidewalk on either side, and do at least one side of those first rather than addressing other streets that may be a little bit higher traffic, but already have one on one side. Harvard and Yale are like that. So if there was some way we could prioritize where there is absolutely no sidewalk, that would really be helpful. Until we get sidewalks on all the streets around the school, then we can go and double up and fill in I think that sounds like a more reasonable way. Thank you.
Thanks, Gary.
Good evening, I'm Teresa Hill. I live at 705 Tennessee Street. After using the current prioritization process for an Old West Lawrence neighborhood project last year that we presented, we identified some improvements, potential improvements in the process. In order to do that, we met with Lan, and a group of representatives got together and drafted some changes that we sent to Jessica in August of last year. I know she has them, and we did that. Aaron recommended that we do that. And just to summarize those changes, they were kind of in three areas, and then we've added one that we put in the memo we sent you. The process is missing some key destinations, sorry. We're trying to make some changes to increase child safety beyond the public school routes, the safe routes. We're trying to connect the neighborhoods. That's what we put in the memo. We don't know how to really reflect that in the process. And we wanted to give greater priority when there is more than one destination. So some of the missing destinations are like the pool, the senior and community centers. There are other schools too. There's St. John's, and then we have Century School, so just identifying that. City events, the bike path, the bus hub, because that's going to attract a lot of people. And intercity buses, we have the Greyhound bus stop, for example, at the library. The current policy recognizes quite nicely the children needs regarding the safe routes by giving added points to those projects. And we believe all children destinations should have the same treatment. So that would be things like the pool, our library, parks, anything involving the safety of those citizens. Improving the connectivity between the neighborhoods could be emphasized, and that would help the neighborhood from being an island. It would improve the access among the children to be able to cross 6th Street from the Pinckney neighborhood to the Old West Lawrence neighborhood. Would make it safer for the children who go to school together, and it would also, improve beyond that for all of us. And finally, we recommend that projects with more than one destination receive points for each and every destination. So, for example, projects impacting the park and the library and the post office and anything else would be rated higher than projects with just one destination, like a bus stop, for example. And that would also be true for multiple occurrences within a category. And what we mean by that are projects impacting public institutions, for example, would receive added points if those institutions were, for example, the community center and the county offices and the police and courts and the city offices, et cetera. You get the point. So just in summary, those improvements that we gave to Jessica included missing pedestrian destinations, increasing child safety beyond the public school routes, connecting neighborhoods, and giving greater priority when there's more than one destination. Thank you. Appreciate
Thank you.
Hi, Michael Allman, 1311 Prairie Avenue. I want to echo what Tressa just said, that's essential that the destinations factor into how these priorities are set and the combinations of them. So yeah, I fully agree with that and add my voice to that. What I'd like to try to do is portray a context in which these priorities could be set. I see the priorities, the factors that affect priorities in three ways. One is the data that takes into consideration, where the school children are, where the volume of traffic is, how wide the crossings are, things of that sort, and tries to sort through and figure there's more risk here, there's less risk there. That's good, and we need that data, but as Chair Evans pointed out, that's the beginning of the conversation. Another part of that conversation is, as Jessica pointed out, the budget. And ultimately, this all comes down to the budget being discussed tomorrow and then in early August, the availability of funds. And I didn't come prepared with the particular numbers, but I'm very frustrated when I when I look at these numbers. Um, combining the bicycle pedestrian line item in the budget with the neighborhood traffic management line item in the budget, those are the two line items that primarily have bicycle funding. The line items that have primarily, well, exclusively pedestrian funding would be the two sidewalk hazardous maintenance lines, the ADA ramp line and the gap line. Just in those hazardous sidewalk lines, one of those this year will have 1,250,000, I believe, and another one I believe is 500,000 for sidewalk hazardous maintenance. That's close, that's ballpark, that's pretty close. For the bicycle side of it, those two that I mentioned, total combined, I believe, is 725, something in that neighborhood, half of which is $375,000 that I say will be for bicycles. The other half will be for pedestrians in both of those. So based on that, that's the budget that the city commission is working with. That's the constraints, no matter what priorities the data says, right? We know that. And I'm very frustrated when I think that the city manager, the finance director, some department heads decide we're going to put $1,250,000 here, 500,000 there, and only 375,000 there. None of us in this room have any say about that prioritizing. That's the big prioritizing. And what can we do about it other than make requests through, well, Chuck or Dave Wagner, somebody within the MSO that actually has some bearing on this. Other than that, I don't know how to affect those numbers. The third factor, though, is people like this who come to the city commission. And I always encourage people to come because the squeaky wheels, the people that really feel it on the street and the speed and then see the kids, you know, hesitating and going a crosswalk, they're motivated to come to the meeting. They feel it. They see it every day. And that affects the priorities, maybe even more so than the other two, I don't know. But I'm just frustrated when the numbers come down the way they do. And, you know, I go to the city commission, I say, please, more money for bicycles or whatever. You know, they may or may not listen. So anyway, I don't know what to suggest, but think about that. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. Okay. Any other discussion? Probably time to move on here to the regular meeting. Is this helpful, Jessica?
Yes, I think so.
You guys took a lot of
You tell
notes.
me next month when I come back with some draft or something.
Okay. Thank you. Transportation Commission meeting. Kind of have a short agenda this evening, so we'll get started with the meeting minutes. Somebody'd like to make a motion? Or do they have comments?
I move to approve the minutes.
Moved by Commissioner Bryan and seconded by Catherine. Thank you. Okay, general public comment. I'll read it again. Public is allowed to speak to any items or issues that are not scheduled on the regular agenda. Public comment will not be received for staff items, commission items, or calendar. Each person or organization will be limited to 3 minutes. As a general practice, the commission will not discuss, debate these items, nor will the commission make decisions on items presented at this time. Individuals are asked to come to the microphone, sign in, and state their name and address. Speakers should address all comments to the commission. So,
Quick point of order, Steve.
yeah.
Did we vote on that, approving the minutes?
Oh, geez.
I was gonna say, I might have missed it, because I'm.
No, thank you so much, Eric. Thank you.
Approved without objection.
All opposed?
I
all
only
in
asked because I
favor?
figured I wasn't here, so I better abstain.
That was me too, I'm with you.
Okay, back to the minutes. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Yeah, opposed? I thought you were going to say no. for
Two
some-
abstentions.
Yeah, 2 abstentions.
Oh, 2 abstentions. I see.
We were both gone.
Okay, thank you. Okay, back to the public comment. Michael?
Yeah, Michael. I can talk about virtually anything in the world tonight except 23rd Street, really, I guess, right? I was curious, actually, the yearly schedule for your work sessions and your meetings. Last month, the work session received the bikeway update plan for Lawrence. And then this month, the bikeway update plan is on the meeting agenda for approval. But now it's been pulled. But if you look at that monthly schedule, it is still there. It was released by staff for public comment on May 14th, public comment for 30 days until June 14th. You received it on, what, June 6th, whenever your meeting was, I forget. But when is this group going, I mean, if any group should be looking at multimodal bicycle pedestrian, I would think this group would. So I'm curious when that will come before you. It's going to go to the MPO and the city commission, but any idea, David?
Yeah, I can speak to that.
Go ahead, David.
I think it's going to the MPO BAC on Wednesday.
This
So,
week?
Yes.
I thought that meeting was no, meeting wasn't canceled. I don't know.
Yeah, so it's going to the MPO BAC before it comes to this
Okay,
group, and that's why it got pushed a month. If it,
okay.
so,
So what, next month, do you think?
yes,
Oh.
it's on our calendar.
Okay,
I did move it on the calendar
okay,
forward a month, so it's August the 5th.
okay, thank you.
Yep.
Thanks.
Thanks, Michael. Any other public comment? Having none, move on to item 3, staff items.
I do have one thing, since Charlie asked me about this last week, I think I'd take a chance to give everyone an update on the East 19th project from Harvard to O'Connell. It's in our CIP to do design this year and then construct the water line next year and then the street in 2021. BG Consultants is the design consultant for the project. They just wrapped up the survey, a topographical survey of the corridor, and they're going to begin putting together some options for different street sections. I believe we had 5 for them to do 5 in the scope. And so staff's meeting with them here in July in the next month or so, and then we'll be coming to you early fall in the September, October window with those different concepts to get feedback on those. So just giving everyone an update on that. It's moving forward, and it'll be coming to you soon.
Thanks.
And that's all staff items that I had.
Charlie, you good with that? Any
Yep.
other questions?
Yep.
Okay.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Commission items, update from Nick on PPAC.
Not really a lot to say, other than the fact that the bus transfer station is still going ahead at the potential location at Bobby Links and Crest Line. They're still working out exactly where that's going to go, but there are talks currently ongoing. So that's about all we got.
When do you think the shovels will be out?
At the rate things are going, I don't know, 2021. It's,
Really?
everything is taking a long time. When you try to work between both governments and the state and KU, there's a lot going on right now. And three parties who aren't known for their swiftness, I suppose you could say. So anyway, we'll see. But at least everything is amicable still, and that they are still on their way to nailing down that site and specifics of where it's going to go. So
Great,
it's good news.
great. Thanks. John, 23rd Street.
Yes, last week was the week that we met to look at the concept for 23rd Street going forward. I'm not going to talk specifically about the concept and the final outcome because no one else has seen it except Ron on the commission. So I don't think it's fair to talk about it till you guys have an opportunity to see it, which I believe will be in September. Is that correct? Assuming.
Tentatively, yeah.
Right.
Yep.
Right.
This fall.
The process was 12 hours last week, spread over 3 days. So I was really impressed with the process, the way they did it. For those of you that have worked for companies that have done SWATs, it's real similar to a SWAT, where you start with everything's on the table and you whittle down, and we went from as many ideas as possible to 3 to 2, and finally landed on 1. There was lots of input from the stakeholders, the owners of the property, from the city, from the public. But I thought the consultant did a really good job in not coming in with any preconceived ideas and allowing people to formulate it and getting a lot of buy-in. And I think everyone left relatively satisfied. Obviously, there's going to be some tweaks and changes as you move forward, but overall, I think I was impressed by the process.
So the next steps are?
The next step is we'll see the concept plan. I assume it's, like I said, it's on for September. I assume the consultant has to get the final report and those things done.
Yeah, the consultant will put together a final report, and that will include all of the public comments that we received and a bit about the process, and they'll present that here this fall if they get it done by September. I'm not sure yet, but tentatively that's what we're shooting for. But yep, they'll give you a final report, and it'd be for you guys to review and make any comments on it before it goes to the city commission. And that's really the beginning of the design process for future reconstruction of 23rd Street from the Haskell Bridge to just east of Harper. So that's in the CIP. And so this process was to kind of get out ahead of that design and have this concept phase and get public involvement and comments before we even started any design. So I would echo what John said. It's kind of a unique process that we hadn't done before, an accelerated 3-day process, but it was, I think it was done very well. And so we're kind of looking forward to keeping that moving.
How far east of Harper are the project limits?
The reconstruction limits go to where the divided section begins, so between O'Connell and Harper.
Oh, okay.
That's what we've identified in the CIP to be reconstructed. There may be some improvements that get made outside of the limits. The study itself went to the east city limits, which would be beyond, out past Venture Park. So if there's opportunity for other landscaping or sidewalk or bike paths, or we talked about gateway signage when you're coming into town, that could be part of the project. There might be some opportunities to do things outside the roadway further, but yeah.
Great, great. Look forward to that. Okay, any other commission items from anyone? Nope,
Do we want to go in order, or should I just,
just go right ahead,
should I just
Nick.
go for it? Okay.
Yeah.
So, I forget her name, Teresa, from the commenters, when she was talking about the prioritization that I guess the projects in Old West Lawrence were saddled with versus what she would like to see based on kind of the reality on the ground, it kind of brought up some interesting points. And some of this may be stemming from my newness to the overall non-motorized transportation prioritization program, but it sounded like, you know, it's a pretty interesting idea to give priority to projects that connect many destinations, not just one or two, not just a school or a college. And, you know, I would say it's not an entirely incorrect idea to want to prioritize places that are already kind of walkable. It does create the potential issue of designating winners and losers in terms of who's going to get rewarded based on what's already there on the ground. So, you know, places like Old West Lawrence and East Lawrence and Pinckney would probably be prioritized were it the case that you know, more destinations equals a more priority kind of location. But I don't know if that's necessarily a bad thing, because it kind of encourages actually building a denser built environment that does encourage walkability to begin with. And then these programs then are just kind of the icing on the cake to tweak any issues, you know, like any safety issues that come with having a lot of people walking, more so than normal. So I guess I'm not really sure where I'm going with this, but I guess the caution here is if we're okay with rewarding walkable places that have built their environment around a car-light lifestyle, that would be a really interesting thing to see worked into the non-motorized prioritization program. And I don't know what the citizens would think about that, because, I mean, perhaps it's possible that those out on 6th and Wakarusa don't really use sidewalks that much beyond walking their dogs, whereas people in East Lawrence use sidewalks every day, all the time. So, I don't know. Could be a very interesting way to skew some of the projects in a more favorable light. So, just some thoughts.
Well, you know, first question I have, is that data or is that more subjective?
It depends on what you count as a destination, and you could do something as easy as just the walk score, right? So the walk score is kind of this nationally recognized, definitely flawed way to quantify how walkable a place is. And it really gives no credence to how dangerous the streets are, to how uphill it is, to how bad the weather is. It really just says, are there things you can walk to within a walk shed of this thing that you're starting from? And that could be a pretty easy way to just start, you know. There are much more complicated indices. I know this partly because my dad, he does this kind of work, so I've been kind of ingrained with it always. But there are a lot of different indices for how you could possibly break down what is a walkable place, right? So, yeah, I think it would be maybe more fair to use a nationally accepted index like the walk score, and say, like, this is our quantity that we're going from. This walk score is 95. Clearly, there are a lot of destinations in the area. So, I don't know. That's a way to start it.
Well, Jessica's not here to comment on that, so.
I can say that, I mean, I think one thing that she's got built already is a demand model that is different from walk score, but it does suggest there's a greater possibility for walking and biking.
Mm-hmm.
So it would seem like that would be a, you know, data model that she's already has in place. I don't recall on the policy if being in a certain, you know, if there was a way to give points based on where a project was inside that demand model. But the map shows, you know, the entire area in around downtown as highest demand for cycling. I don't quite remember the pedestrian demand model, but I'm pretty sure she built one like that. So it would seem like we already have the things in place that would be kind of a proxy for that.
So I suppose in that case, how would we use that data to address Teresa's question of, you know, if you're just looking at the school, it's one thing, but there's multiple schools, there's multiple library in the pool and everything. I guess I wonder how one would address that given the data we already have, and that's not something I can answer. That sounds like a Jessica kind of question, so.
Mm-hmm.
I spoke with Jessica about this several months ago. I can't remember the entire conversation because it's been a while. Maybe we're going to follow up at some later date. But this is something I've thought about a lot, and also I've talked to Teresa also 7 months ago. And I do think that people often choose to live near downtown based on being able to walk, or might choose a particular neighborhood because of that. And after going through, like, we have the land use planning process, and one of the aspirations of that is to, and any of our plans to be more bikeable and walkable, and yet someone pointed out, it might have been Nick, that you can't even recreate downtown based on most of our current codes because of parking minimums. And so it does seem like when you have people who pick to walk a place and it's already somewhat walkable, and then you have sort of the suburbs everywhere else, that you really can't recreate that, or at least not at this point, and we're still building in a way that's very car focused. It seems like the focus should be on, if we're ever going to make Lawrence really more walkable, the focus should be a little bit weighted towards areas that are already welcoming to walk. And by that I mean you might have my husband walks to work every day, but he walks through the woods, so you don't need to do anything there. But I guess the thing is, there are people who might live out west who walk or bike every day to work. And they're probably going to do that anyway. But like you had mentioned, the walk shed, if it's a quarter to a half mile and it's safer and somebody wants to be able to do it, I just think that's going to make a bigger difference. So I think we've phrased it before, like the best for the most, or something like that. So I've felt for a long time that you can't leave out other neighborhoods altogether, and I think that's for like equity issues and stuff like that. But I do think if you focus on making places that are already somewhat walkable more comfortable to walk in, it's going to make a big difference.
And I think the equity issue is a really important one. I don't know if Lawrence has that issue yet, simply because there are a range of incomes in neighborhoods that are walkable and in incomes that are not walkable, which is to our benefit at this point in terms of, if you choose projects in areas that are already walkable, you really aren't choosing rich people over poor people, which you are in some cities, like Boulder probably, right? Where like the really nice areas are the expensive areas, or DC. But you get to some places like Houston, for example, where there are really walkable areas that are really poor. And yeah, you wouldn't really be choosing, I guess, a winner in terms of rich people get richer. You'd be choosing the walkable people get more walkable, which is good.
I would actually say some of the lower incomes areas in Boulder are more walkable, but
really?
there's just no low income left. So
yeah, that's true. So interesting. Sounds like this is going to be something that will probably feed into Plan 2040 once it finally leads to some policies that adhere to its ideas, hopefully. I did have another thing about walking. So this is really more of a spur of the moment thing. It's a little bit hot out there, and I walked here, and I walked fast because I'm kind of late, and the sun it beats down on you. Having lived in other places that have canopies on sidewalks, and watching Lawrence go through this thing where we told what was it, Quentin's or Dempsey's or something, to tear down a canopy. Really? Has anybody ever walked on the sidewalks when it's hot outside? We don't have street trees everywhere. It seems to me that thinking about pedestrian comfort, and I'm sure Carol can probably attest to this quite a bit, pedestrian comfort is really important sometimes in incentivizing people to walk who wouldn't otherwise walk. If you know it's going to be an unshaded concrete jungle on your way to a destination, and there's a free parking spot at that destination, guess what that person's going to choose, right? Whereas if it's pretty pleasant and there's, a trellis or an arbor or a pergola over the general area that you're going to walk, it's a lot more comfortable. And there's a reason that hot countries' built environment look the way they do. They're covered in canopies and awnings and everything. I mean, it's one of those things where maybe that could be the kind of project that could help out. And that's not even something that the government has to spend money on. They could just allow people to build canopies over sidewalks. So again, not really sure I have any policy recommendations on this particular front, but it's certainly something to keep in mind where we sometimes get unintended consequences trying to go for conformity in terms of having every facade look the exact same. Like, does that affect the walkability? A little bit.
Well, we walk a lot, and we walk on Mass and around Mass a lot. We choose the side of the street that's in the shade.
Yeah.
And unless the sun's here.
Right, yeah, there's not much you
You
can
can
do
almost do it. I mean, there's maybe an hour or so every day. And we actually look for ways to walk further.
Yeah,
But
and in
that's
places like
not
Philadelphia,
the
that's
general
easy,
practice
yeah.
for people like you, I know. You know,
Well,
who may be in a hurry.
It kind of is. I was in Philly over last weekend, and we walked the entire way from South Philly to downtown, which is a decent hike, all on the shady side of the street, and it was rather comfortable.
Mhm.
And I realized that only works when you have 0-foot setbacks. It doesn't work once you start having these, suburban lawns and parking lots that set the building so far back, and height restrictions where there is no way to actually shade the street. So I think it definitely works on Massachusetts and to a certain extent on New Hampshire, but there's not a lot of places where there's truly a shady side of the street that's not because of old trees. So I feel for the people out in New West Lawrence and Prairie Park where there's not a lot of really big mature trees where everything is a really sunny sidewalk. That gets tough. No, anyway.
All right. Duly noted. Any other commission items? Calendar.
Next meeting is August the 5th. As I mentioned earlier, the bike plan is going to be presented then on a regular meeting also. We were going to bring back the revised non-motorized project prioritization policy based off some of the comments we received tonight. And then on the study session, we had information on regulations for electric vehicles and to receive the request from VioRide to amend our bike share contract, which would include the scooters. So that's on the study session. That'll be August the 5th.
Great. Questions, comments on the calendar?
At some point, I guess I'd like to know, like on some basis every year, we hear from the transit director. So I don't know when that's appropriate, but it seems like with the change in the routes that typically happen this time of year, that August would be appropriate, but it's not a huge issue. It's just like, there ought to be some expectation every year that we, even if it's just 10 minutes. you know,
There's going to be
kinda
very few routes
have him-
changed. I think it's one route is being slightly changed.
Yeah.
Forgot about that one, sorry.
And I'm just thinking like that relationship with Bob, I think is important for us to continue to have. And then, it doesn't have to be a big ordeal, just how's transportation from transit's perspective coming along? Not saying that we don't have a good PTAC rep, but I feel like
I know what you mean.
it's important to have Bob's attention, I think.
I agree.
So,
Okay. I think we're ready for adjournment. Anybody would like to move?
I would motion that we adjourn the meeting.
Second?
Second.
Great. Motion by Nick and seconded by Ron. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Any abstains? Thanks.